Welcome everybody. Welcome to this lecture on Introduction to Microservices. My name is Syed, of course, and I'm an enterprise architect. I've been in the field for a little over 20 years, and I've managed several projects, architected several projects. As a senior enterprise project manager, of course, a solutions architect, I'm going to break down the concept of microservices versus monolithic architecture and really give you the approach as to what the benefits are and what the differences are between the microservices and monolithic application development life cycles. We'll also talk about limitations and some challenges, the advantages and disadvantages in which aspect monolithic application development is better as compared to microservices architecture. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about just the basic fundamentals, introducing you to the microservices architecture. So stay tuned and let's take a look at what are microservices. Welcome everybody. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the overview of what are microservices, some of the limitations of microservices, challenges, and we'll also dive into some sample application later on towards the end of this short course. But we know that monolithic software development has been going around for decades, but it's only for the last decade or so, or even less, we have shifted towards the microservices architecture. The real benefit of the microservices architecture is the fact that we break the large piece of software development practices per se into smaller chunks, and that's easier to manage and easier to flow, easier to automate, and so on. So primarily looking at the agile methodology, right? And that's really what the practice is for agile methodology, and of course lean as well, where you're eliminating waste and you're automating your processes. And that's really the key for getting into microservices, because it's faster delivery of software. And we know today apps are just crazy. Everything is just app and everything is in the cloud. So before I dive further, let's stick to the basics. So we're going to talk about what microservices are, some of the limitations, challenges as we move forward. So later in this course, I'm going to talk about the architecting microservices, building, communicating between all these elements and microservices, and then of course securing and delivering. This will sort of like in a nutshell complete the entire process. I'll also touch base on the software development lifecycle and of course the DevOps lifecycle, and why DevOps is so important and of course is growing exponentially. In fact, we can't find DevOps people, right? DevOps engineers, solutions architect is just a shortage, and there is a reason why, because of course demand and supply, enterprise companies are demanding more and more. So we'll talk about all of these elements. All right, so what are microservices? Let's take a look at what microservices are and what are they made up of and how do they work. So let's dive into more of those. So microservices, think of those as being, independently, like I mentioned earlier, small chunks of piece of data for information per se, whatever you want to call it, right? Just in layman terms, so you can deploy those services, sequentially, so that it goes through a process. And of course, how small should they be? It's easier to collaborate when you're developing an application, right? So that's the idea. Why do we need microservices? Well, like I mentioned, monolithic software development was a huge problem, because you have 100 developers sitting in one room and all of a sudden no one knows what to do, right? Because there's a whole software and the entire software has to be made first and then sort of like delivered to the customer. And if there's a problem with the software, then the customer has to send back the entire software and then the developers have to go at it again. Well, with microservices architecture, it's like delivering in pieces, right? So you deliver a small chunk of software that you develop or app that you develop, and then you let it go to the client end. And if there's a change that needs to be done, only that particular small chunk kind of goes back into the pipeline, right? So you get the idea, right? goes back into the pipeline, and then of course changes are made by the developers, and then quality assurance or quality testing is done on the software and whatnot. It goes through a process that's called the DevOps, or just the pipeline, so that it flows through the pipeline again. The entire cycle is sort of like could be automated, and that's the job of a DevOps engineer, primarily to build and to architect all these pipelines. So that's why you need microservices, and that's why almost all app development and software development now today is following the microservices architecture. All right, so yeah, there you go. Like I mentioned, monolithic architecture simply was a single code base. It's just one piece of big, large software, single process. Everything was made and then, of course, delivered to the customer. So single host, single database, consistent technology, right? Everything in one box. That's monolith, right? That's why it's called huge, because depending on the app or the software that you're creating, it would just grow. So the code base would just grow humongous, right? And that's really what it is. Now, with that said, keep in mind that these are just the developers, right? This is the actual software development. It has nothing to do with the actual operations end, where the software is going to be uploaded, who's going to handle the front end, who's going to handle the back end. Everything is just happening at one room, right? So that's really what the problem was with monolithic application development was. But there's some benefits also. And of course, if you have everything in one place, it's easier to manage. That makes sense. Simplicity, one code base. If there's a problem, boom, you go find it. Deployment is just one application. You deploy it, and then, if you want to replace it, you can replace it. So they're not, wrong per se, or it's not incorrect way of software development. It's just that the challenge occurs when, the code base grows. So, if it grows large, that's really what the problem is, right? But in any case, there are some benefits, like I mentioned, right here that you see, are fairly straightforward and kind of make sense too. All right, so do we really need microservices? That's $1 million question. And in the real world scenario, I've come across many applications that are actually beneficial in a monolithic environment. And let me give you an example. A small app, efficient small app, for example, would be ideal in a monolithic environment. But a large app or a distributed environment, right, where you have a global environment, where you have data centers spread all across the globe, one in Europe, one in Asia, one in the United States, and then each of those applications, or that application, has to sort of like balance itself with the number of users and so on. So that's really when the microservices would be more beneficial. All right, so the problem of scale. Monoliths can work well with small applications. Yeah, I just said that. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So yes, they're very efficient monolithics with smaller software applications, or small apps or softwares. The problem of scale is where you have many developers sitting in one room or one area or one building, and then if there are many users, just like I mentioned earlier, if you have an app that is going global, and there are users downloading the app in Europe and Asia, whatever it is, Australia, US, and that's really when the problem starts to occur with the monolithic, right? Because the data is now growing. And of course, you're storing data in respective data centers. For example, if you're using AWS platform, you have AWS data centers in Europe, in Asia, in UAE, in the United States, and all over the world, right? So each of these, S3 storage, or the data itself, maybe is stored locally, right? And that's really what the problem occurs when you want to scale the application. And then, it's difficult to maintain, of course, entangled modules. That kind of makes sense because the software code goes all over the place. And then technical debt. That's a term that we use, within the tech industries. Is think of this as, there's just work and that doesn't pay you, right? So you're not getting anything out of the work that you're doing. And companies have a lot of technical debt, guys. And this is really the key focus on, enterprise organizations. They want to reduce the technical debt. In other words, there's redundant work. You don't need that, right? So work that you have to do, but you don't really need it. So that's really an important area. So these are the problems of scale. So monolithic problems, difficult to deploy. Of course, you take the entire chunk of software and then you deploy it. Boom, it could go right, it could go wrong. It's risky, right? And if there's downtime, so if there's some change that needs to be done, the client says, hey, why don't you change the title on my website, for example, right? Well, it may require some downtime, or add a new functionality to the software. That would definitely require downtime. And these days, in today's world, we don't want to have any downtime, right? We want to be able to have a streamlined, real-time, updated information, right, or data. And so that's really one of the issues with Monolith. And of course, I talked about the scalability is difficult to scale. Horizontal scaling often not possible. Vertical scaling is expensive. Kind of makes sense. The whole application must be scaled. So whether it's from the hardware side, from the software side, everything has to be scaled, right? And there's a lot of downtime. And of course, it reduces agility because now you're sitting with a piece of software, and then of course developers are working on it, and that's it, right? You're just sitting on it. So you can't really do anything else. So distributed monolith is another architecture that we can take a look at, and it kind of works where you have many services, but using the shared database. Now, working with a shared database could also be an issue because shared database kind of like the whole load, right? The whole pressure is on one simple database. So if that database goes down, guess what? All these services, all the attached services are also down. So everything must be deployed together with distributed monolith. We can't really do one at a time. It has to be one or nothing, right? And new features, of course, they require changes everywhere. So if you change one thing on service 2, for example, the same change has to occur on service 4 and service 3, and likewise, right? Kind of makes sense. So how are microservices better than monoliths? Well, that's what we're going to talk about, and this is really where the shift is now happening from the monolith to the microservices architecture of software development. And of course, how can they help us? Well, certainly there are many benefits, because within the microservices architecture, you can incorporate agile methodology, lean concepts, and that adds value to the entire pipeline of software development. You have QA testers, you have DevOps engineers, you have solutions architect, you have developers. So basically combining the operations team with the software development or the developers themselves, and kind of working in a coherent manner in a single pipeline, in a single process. And of course, that is automated. So if that is automated, then boom, easier to change. So if the client, for example, requests a change, all you have to do is just do a release cut, or just do the change and go through a pipeline. The developers change the code. Of course, they branch it out. They're using Git, or the Subvert, or the SVM, or other Git software, for example, and then they simply throw the software in the pipeline. They commit those changes, and then of course it goes to the QA testing, and the entire process is automated, right? So that's really how microservices are very efficient and beneficial. There you go. So you can see the benefit of microservices. So they're small services. They can own by a team. Small teams, they take ownership for that particular chunk of service. Technology by choice, you can adopt new technology, you can use the right tool, and of course standardize where it makes sense, so you can repeat the same process. The third benefit, of course, is individual deployment. It lowers the risk, minimize downtime, and there are more frequent updates. And that kind of makes sense because in today's software, everything is changing almost on a regular basis, on daily basis, weekly basis, right? So that's where the concept of sprints come in, or Scrum concepts also enter into play, because all of these are adding value to your bottom line, to the pipeline, right? To the software development practices. The next benefit is scaling. Scale services individually, and they're cost effective because you don't have to shut down the whole software, or bring down the whole software, or bring it downtime. It's really just services individually, work on those services and throw them back into the pipeline. Kind of makes sense, right? Yeah. And of course, agility, like I mentioned earlier, is you can adapt rapidly, and it's easier to use because with agile methodology or agile practices, It's really, really efficient. And it doesn't, mean that you have to worry about the entire software application. You're just focusing on this particular or that particular piece of service that you want to, change, right? So many, many benefits of microservices. Are there any downsides to microservices? We'll take a look at that, because definitely as microservices architecture grows and your application grows, your user base grows, there may be some areas that you need to keep an eye out. Microservices do solve some problems, but definitely bring in new challenges. So let's take a look at what those challenges are so we can better understand all these challenges. Number one challenge is developer productivity. And the reason is simple, because guess what, guys? You have developers sitting in Europe. You have remote people working. You have developers, working out of San Francisco, out of New York, Chicago, wherever you are. So again, these are all distributed teams, and that kind of is certainly a challenge for microservices. How do you actually connect with all of them? Do you conduct virtual meetings? Do you conduct Zoom meetings? Or, of course, they cannot physically fly in one place and meet, right? So how can you make it easy for developers to be productive working on the actual software development? The next challenge is complex interactions. Take care to avoid inefficient, chatty communications between microservices. And that happens because as we start to work on all these services, guess what? There's redundancy always added, and there are things sitting there that we're not going to use. Third is deployment. You'll need to automate the process, and that's very, very important. In my practical experience as an enterprise architect and a DevOps engineer, it's you'll save tons and tons of time if you just automate the process, guys. Whether it's through shell scripting, whether it's through building an effective pipeline and using the right tools. If you want to go check out the DevOps engineer full course, please do so at claydesk.com, or if you want to do it on YouTube, if you want to take it for free, yeah, I have a full course on YouTube as well. So go check those out. So deployment, of course, is a challenge, right? If you do not automate the processes, then definitely you're going to see a lot of these things kind of give you a lot of headache. And of course, monitoring. You need a centralized place to check logs and monitor for problems. And that's a challenge because distributed teams, physically and otherwise, it's just difficult to maintain logs, because you have logs coming out of AWS from another data center. You have logs. You're basically collecting all these logs and kind of identifying. So that's really some time-consuming process. So these are some of the challenges that you need to be aware of when you're working with the microservices architecture of software development. Now, can you succeed with microservices? Well, that's $1 million question, isn't it, right? So yeah, definitely, because there's overall impact, overall efficiency, and the way software is being now developed, the way apps are now being coded, for example. All right, perfect, great. So let's summarize what we've just talked about. We looked at the microservices architecture at a high level, of course. We did compare it with the monolithic software development practices, whereas implementing microservices, some of the benefits, some of the challenges, and now you have a solid understanding of the way software is developed, right? We also talked about the benefits and, of course, the challenges of microservices. So this is all about introducing microservices to you. We're going to take a look at next how to architect these microservices. And of course, I'll give you an example and demo also in the next session, in the next lecture, so you really understand how they're actually architected and the way they work, right? So now that you have a solid understanding, we're ready to move on to the next lecture. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next lecture.